I was 58 years old when I discovered that the two people I trusted most in this world had been lying to me for nearly 3 decades. And the strangest part is that the moment itself didn't feel dramatic at first. There were no screaming arguments, no broken plates, no slammed doors. Just a quiet house, an early return from work, and a sight that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late October. The kind of gray day where the sky looks heavy, like it might rain but never quite does. I had left work early because a shipment at the warehouse had been delayed and there was nothing left for me to supervise. After 35 years in logistics, I had learned that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is simply go home. Normally I would have called my wife Sarah to tell her I was on my way, but that day I didn't. I figured I would surprise her. Maybe we'd have coffee together or go for a walk before dinner. Our house had grown quiet over the years since the kids moved out, and small moments together had become something I appreciated more with age. Sarah and I had been married for 32 years. That's long enough to build a whole world together. Long enough to forget what life looked like before the other person arrived. We raised 2 children, Lily and Ethan, paid off a mortgage that once felt impossible, buried both of our parents, and survived more financial scares than I care to remember. From the outside, our life looked stable. Predictable. Safe. But as I would soon learn, appearances can hide a lot of things. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something that struck me as slightly unusual. My younger brother Gary's truck was parked outside the house. Gary lived about 15 minutes away, so it wasn't completely strange for him to visit. Over the years he had become part of our daily life. He joined us for holidays, barbecues, birthdays, and sometimes even random weeknight dinners when he didn't feel like cooking for himself. Still, seeing his truck in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon felt a little unexpected. Gary was 6 years younger than me, the kind of guy who always seemed to move through life a little faster and a little looser than I ever did. Where I was careful, he was impulsive. Where I was quiet, he was the kind of person who could walk into a bar and leave with 3 new friends and someone's phone number. Growing up, I had always felt responsible for him. Our father died when Gary was 19 and I was already married to Sarah by then. From that moment on, some part of me quietly took on the role of protector. Maybe that's why what happened next hurt the way it did. When I stepped inside the house, everything seemed normal at first. The living room was quiet, the television off. The smell of coffee lingered faintly in the air. Somewhere in the back of the house I heard a muffled laugh. Sarah's laugh. Followed by Gary's voice. I remember thinking they were probably sitting in the kitchen talking about something trivial. Maybe he stopped by to help her with something around the house. Gary had always been good with repairs. But as I walked down the hallway, the sound of their voices changed. It grew softer, closer together somehow. Then I reached the doorway. And everything in my world shifted in a way that is difficult to describe. Sarah was standing near the kitchen counter with Gary's arms wrapped around her. Not the kind of quick, casual hug family members give each other. This was something else entirely. His hands were resting on her back, pulling her close. Her face was pressed against his shoulder. For a moment my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. They hadn't noticed me yet. Gary leaned down slightly and kissed her. Not on the cheek. On the lips. The room felt suddenly very small. My heart didn't race the way you might expect in a moment like that. Instead it felt like everything inside my chest had gone strangely quiet, like the world had been muted. Gary was the first one who saw me. His eyes widened immediately and he stepped back as if someone had shoved him. "Tom," he started. Sarah turned around. The look on her face was something I will never forget. It wasn't just fear. It was the expression of someone who realizes a secret they thought was safely buried has suddenly been pulled into the light. For several seconds none of us spoke. I remember noticing strange details in that moment. The way the kitchen clock ticked loudly on the wall. The way sunlight was coming through the window and reflecting off the countertop. The way Sarah's hands were trembling slightly. Finally Gary opened his mouth again. "This isn't what it looks like." It's amazing how often people say that exact sentence when something is exactly what it looks like. I studied both of their faces carefully. 32 years of marriage teaches you how to read someone's expressions in ways that go deeper than words. And in that moment I knew one thing with complete certainty. This wasn't the first time. Strangely enough, I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything or demand explanations. Instead I simply nodded once and said something that surprised even me. "I'll give you 2 minutes." Then I turned around and walked out of the house. I spent the next hour driving around town without any clear destination. My hand stayed steady on the steering wheel, but inside my head something heavy was beginning to move. Anger would have been easier. Rage would have given me somewhere to direct the pain. But what I felt instead was something colder. Questions. Dozens of them. How long? Why Gary? When did it start? And perhaps the worst one of all. Was my entire marriage built on something I never truly understood? By the time I returned home, Gary's truck was gone. Sarah was sitting alone at the kitchen table. Her eyes were red. She looked like she had been crying for a long time. When she saw me walk in, she stood up slowly. "Tom," she said softly. I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said. She froze. "I don't want explanations right now." The words felt calm leaving my mouth, but they carried a weight behind them that I knew she could hear. "Because if I ask you the wrong question," I continued, "you might give me the wrong answer." She stared at me as if trying to understand what I meant. I took a seat across from her at the table. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "I'm going to take a few days. Maybe a week. I'm not going to shout, and I'm not going to throw you out of the house." Her eyes filled with tears again. "But I am going to find out the truth." She opened her mouth as if to protest. I leaned forward slightly. "The whole truth." Something in my voice must have told her that I meant exactly what I said, because she slowly lowered her gaze to the table. That night we slept in separate rooms for the first time in 32 years. And the next morning, I made the first call that would unravel a secret far older than I could possibly imagine. I hired a private investigator. At the time, I thought I was uncovering an affair. What I didn't know yet was that I was about to uncover a story that had begun nearly 30 years earlier, a story involving my brother, my wife, and a truth about my own family that would change everything. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen. The house was quiet in that heavy way it sometimes is after something terrible has happened, like the walls themselves are trying to process what they witnessed. I lay there for a few minutes staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene from the kitchen over and over in my mind, trying to find some angle that would make it less real. But every version ended the same way, Sarah in my brother's arms, Gary kissing her like he had done it 100 times before. Eventually I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where Sarah and I had eaten dinner together almost every night for 32 years. It's strange how familiar places can suddenly feel foreign when trust disappears. Sarah came downstairs about half an hour later. Her eyes were swollen and her hair looked like she hadn't slept at all. She stopped when she saw me sitting there, as if she wasn't sure whether she was allowed in the room. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she quietly poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. The silence between us felt thick, but I had already decided the night before that I wasn't going to have the confrontation she expected. I wasn't ready for that yet. I needed information first. I needed facts. Finally she whispered my name, the same way she had said it the night before, like she was testing whether it still belonged to her. "Tom, please let me explain." I shook my head slowly and took a sip of coffee. "Not yet," I said calmly. She stared at me in confusion. I could see she had prepared herself for anger, for shouting, for accusations. Instead she was getting something much worse. Distance. "You'll get your chance," I continued. "But not until I know exactly what I'm dealing with." She opened her mouth to protest again, but something in my expression must have stopped her. The truth is that by that point I had already started thinking differently about the situation. The moment I saw Gary and Sarah together, something inside me shifted from emotion to analysis. It's a habit I developed over decades in logistics. When something goes wrong, you don't panic. You gather data. You trace the chain of events. You figure out where the system broke. After Sarah left the kitchen, I finished my coffee, grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The morning air felt cold and sharp, and for the first time since the day before I allowed myself to admit something I hadn't wanted to say out loud yet. What I had seen in the kitchen didn't look like a recent mistake. It looked practiced. Familiar. The kind of closeness that doesn't develop overnight. By 9 o'clock I was sitting in a small office downtown across from a man named Victor Alvarez, a private investigator who had been recommended by a friend at work years earlier. Victor looked like someone who had seen every possible version of human betrayal. He listened quietly while I explained the situation, occasionally writing notes in a small leather notebook. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me carefully. "How long do you think it's been going on?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "I have no idea," I said. "But my gut says longer than it should." Victor nodded slowly. "Most affairs start small," he said. "But the ones involving family, those tend to have deeper roots." I hired him that day without hesitation. Over the next few weeks Victor began piecing together details about Gary and Sarah's movements. At first the information was exactly what you might expect. Text messages. Occasional lunches together. Meetings when they believed no one was watching. According to Victor, the two of them had been seeing each other regularly for at least 6 months. When he first told me that number, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. 6 months was terrible, but it was still recent enough to believe that my entire marriage hadn't been a lie. For a few days I allowed myself to believe that version of the story. Then Victor called me again. "There's something else," he said over the phone. His voice sounded different this time, heavier. We met again in the same office where our first conversation had taken place. He placed a thin folder on the desk between us and slid it toward me. I went deeper, he explained. Older records. Old phone logs. Financial patterns. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were printed records going back decades. "Tom," Victor said quietly, "this didn't start 6 months ago." I looked up at him, confused. "Then when did it start?" He hesitated before answering. "About 28 years ago." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him. 28 years was almost the entire length of my marriage. Victor explained that Gary and Sarah had been involved once before in their 20s, long before cell phones and digital records made secrets harder to hide. According to the information he had uncovered, their relationship began during a period when I was working nearly 70 hours a week trying to stabilize our finances after our first child was born. Gary had been spending more time at our house back then, helping Sarah with small repairs and errands while I was constantly at work. Victor looked at me carefully as he continued speaking, as if measuring how much truth I could handle at once. "It didn't last long the first time," he said. "From what I can tell, it ended after a few months." My mind immediately started replaying old memories from that period of my life. I remembered how exhausted I had been, how often I came home late to find Gary already sitting in the living room joking with Sarah. At the time I had been grateful that my younger brother was helping keep her company while I worked. Victor continued explaining that the relationship appeared to have stopped suddenly back then, and for nearly 20 years there was no clear evidence that anything inappropriate continued between them. But about 8 years ago, something changed. Their communication started again. At first it looked harmless, messages about family gatherings, quick conversations about the kids, occasional favors. Then the tone gradually shifted into something more personal. Eventually the relationship became physical again. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, "that this didn't start 6 months ago?" Victor shook his head. "No," he replied. "It started almost 3 decades ago." I leaned back in the chair, feeling as though someone had quietly removed the floor beneath me. But Victor wasn't finished. He pointed to a document inside the folder. "There's another detail," he said carefully. "Something about your family history." I looked down at the paper, not yet realizing that the next truth waiting in that folder would be even more devastating than the affair itself. Because buried in the past of my own family was a secret about my father, my brother, and a night that had happened long before I ever married Sarah. A secret that would soon make me question not only my marriage, but my entire understanding of who we really were as a family. I left Victor's office that afternoon with the folder resting on the passenger seat beside me, and the entire drive home felt strangely quiet even though traffic was heavy. Every red light seemed to last longer than it should have, every car around me moving slower than usual, as if the world had somehow sensed that something inside my life had cracked open. For nearly 3 decades I had believed my marriage was built on something solid, something ordinary but dependable, and now a private investigator was telling me that the foundation of that life had been shifting long before I ever noticed it. The idea that Sarah and Gary had crossed a line once, 28 years ago, was bad enough, but what unsettled me even more was the way Victor had paused before mentioning something about my family history. That hesitation had stayed with me the entire drive home like an unfinished sentence. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. The same porch light, the same maple tree near the garage, the same curtains Sarah had insisted on keeping for almost 10 years even though our daughter Lily had teased her about them being outdated. Yet something about the place felt different now, as if the meaning of every familiar object had shifted slightly. I walked inside and found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table again, almost in the exact position where she had been the morning before. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea, but it had gone cold. She looked up when she heard the door and studied my face carefully, as if searching for some clue about what I had learned. For a moment I considered telling her everything I knew so far, but something stopped me. It wasn't anger or revenge. It was the quiet realization that once the truth started coming out, there would be no way to slow it down again. Instead I walked past the kitchen without saying anything and went upstairs to the small office where we kept old files and family documents. The folder Victor had given me felt heavier now, as if it contained more than just paper. I opened it again and reread the notes he had gathered about Sarah and Gary's early relationship. According to his findings, the first affair had begun during a period when I was working nearly non-stop trying to keep our finances afloat. Lily had just been born, and the pressure of providing for a new family had pushed me into long hours that sometimes stretched past midnight. Gary, who was still living nearby and drifting between jobs at the time, had been spending more and more time at the house. At the time I had been grateful for his help. Now those same memories felt like shadows I had never noticed before. But the part that truly unsettled me was the final page in the folder. Victor had written a short note in his own handwriting at the bottom: possible family connection prior to marriage. Worth investigating further. I stared at that sentence for a long time, trying to understand what it might mean. My parents had died years ago, and whatever secrets they carried had supposedly been buried with them. Yet the way Victor had said the words in his office suggested that something about their past might still be affecting the present. The next evening Victor called me again. His voice sounded cautious, the way someone speaks when they know the information they're about to share could cause serious damage. He asked if we could meet in person rather than discussing things over the phone, and an hour later I was sitting across from him in the same chair as before. This time there was no folder on the desk, just a single photograph and a few typed pages. Victor slid the photograph toward me first. It showed my father standing outside an old farmhouse, his arm resting casually on the shoulder of a younger man I didn't recognize. Both of them were smiling in that relaxed way people used to smile in old family pictures. "Do you recognize the other man?" Victor asked. I shook my head. My father had known many people through work and church, but the face in the photo didn't trigger any memories. "That's William Harris," Victor explained. "He lived in your hometown about 40 years ago." The name meant nothing to me. Victor leaned forward slightly and tapped the photograph. "He also happens to be Sarah's biological father." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him. "What are you saying?" I asked. Victor took a breath before continuing. "Your wife's father and your father were close friends for years. They worked together, socialized together, and apparently spent a lot of time around each other's families." I felt a strange tension forming in my chest. "Sarah told me her father died when she was young," I said. "That part is true," Victor replied. "But there's more to the story." He handed me the typed pages. They were copies of old local records, including birth certificates and hospital documentation. As I scanned them, the meaning slowly began to form in my mind like a picture emerging from fog. "Your brother Gary," Victor said quietly, "may not actually be your father's biological son." The words hung in the air between us. For several seconds I couldn't respond because my brain was trying to fit the statement into a lifetime of memories. Gary and I had grown up in the same house, fought the same childhood arguments, buried the same father at the same funeral. The idea that we might not share the same blood felt surreal. Victor continued speaking carefully. "There were rumors in your hometown years ago about your mother having an affair with William Harris. Nothing was ever proven, but the timing of Gary's birth lines up almost perfectly with a period when your father was away for work." I leaned back in the chair, feeling the world tilt slightly beneath me. "So you're telling me my brother might actually be Sarah's half-brother?" Victor nodded slowly. "It's possible." The implication hit me immediately. If Gary and Sarah shared the same father without knowing it, their relationship decades later would be even more complicated than I had imagined. But before I could process that thought fully, Victor added another piece to the puzzle. "There's something else you should consider," he said. "When the first affair happened 28 years ago, your daughter Lily had just been born." My heart skipped a beat. I knew exactly what he was suggesting before he said it. "I'm not saying this is the case," Victor continued carefully, "but given the timeline, it might be worth confirming paternity." The room felt suddenly too small. For nearly 3 decades I had believed Lily was my daughter without question. She had my stubbornness, my dry sense of humor, even the same crooked smile my father used to have. The thought that any of that might be an illusion was almost unbearable. When I left Victor's office that night the air outside felt colder than before. I sat in the car for several minutes staring at the steering wheel, trying to absorb everything I had just learned. The betrayal between Sarah and Gary was already painful enough, but now it was tangled with something deeper and older, something rooted in secrets that might have started long before I even married Sarah. By the time I returned home, the house was dark except for the light in the living room. Sarah was sitting on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders. When she saw me walk in, she stood up slowly, her eyes searching mine again. "Tom," she said quietly, "please, we can't keep living like this." For a moment I considered telling her everything Victor had discovered about our parents, about Gary, about the possibility that our entire family history might be built on a lie. But instead I asked her a different question. "When did it start?" I said. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if she had been waiting for that moment. 28 years ago, she whispered. Hearing her confirm the same number Victor had given me felt like a door closing somewhere inside my chest. "And Lily?" I asked slowly. Sarah's eyes filled with tears immediately. She looked down at the floor and didn't answer right away, and in that silence I felt a new kind of fear spreading through me. Because sometimes the most terrifying answers are the ones people hesitate to give. And as Sarah finally opened her mouth to speak, I realized that the truth about my marriage was only one part of a much larger secret that had been hiding inside our family for decades. Sarah didn't answer my question right away. She sat down slowly on the couch again as if her legs had suddenly lost their strength, and for several seconds the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the wall clock near the hallway. I had heard that clock every day for years without ever noticing it, but that night the sound felt sharp, almost accusatory, like time itself had been quietly counting the years that the truth remained hidden. I stood across from her with my hands in my pockets, trying to keep my voice steady even though my chest felt tight. I repeated the question in a calmer tone. "Sarah. Lily. Is she my daughter?" The moment the words left my mouth, I knew there was no way to take them back. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again I saw something in her expression that told me the answer before she even spoke. It wasn't guilt exactly, or even shame. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that you forget what it feels like to stand without it. "I never wanted this to happen," she said quietly. "Not like this." I felt my jaw tighten slightly. "That's not what I asked." She nodded slowly and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I don't know for sure," she whispered. The words landed somewhere deep in my stomach. I stared at her, trying to understand what she meant. "You don't know?" I repeated. Sarah shook her head again, this time more firmly. "Back then everything was chaos," she said. "You were working almost all the time, Gary was around helping with things, and I was exhausted with a newborn and barely sleeping. It happened once, maybe twice. And then it stopped." I felt a wave of cold anger begin to rise in my chest. "You're telling me you slept with my brother while our daughter was a newborn?" Sarah flinched slightly at the sharpness in my voice but didn't deny it. "It was a mistake," she said quickly. "A terrible mistake. And it ended almost immediately. We both knew it was wrong." I let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was nothing humorous about it. "Apparently it didn't end permanently," I said. Sarah lowered her gaze again. "No," she admitted softly. For several seconds neither of us spoke. My mind kept replaying the same realization over and over. If Sarah truly didn't know who Lily's biological father was, then for 28 years I might have been living with a question I never even knew existed. Finally I said the words that had already begun forming in my head during the drive home. "We're doing a DNA test." Sarah nodded immediately, almost with relief, as if she had expected that decision and perhaps even hoped for it. "Okay," she said quietly. "If that's what you need." I studied her face carefully. "It's not what I need," I replied. "It's what the truth needs." The next few days passed in a strange emotional fog. We spoke very little except when necessary, and the house felt more like a temporary shelter than the home we had built together over 3 decades. I ordered a DNA testing kit online and told both of our children that I wanted to check some family health markers for future medical records. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it certainly wasn't the whole truth either. Lily and Ethan both agreed without much hesitation. They were adults now, living their own lives in different cities, and they trusted me enough not to question the request too deeply. Still, the guilt of involving them in something so painful without their knowledge sat heavily in my chest. A week later the test kits arrived in the mail. I remember holding the small package in my hands and feeling an unexpected wave of dread. Part of me realized that once those samples were sent away, the future of our entire family would begin moving toward an answer none of us could control. That evening Sarah and I sat at the same kitchen table where so many ordinary dinners had taken place over the years. Neither of us spoke much while preparing the samples. The instructions were simple enough: a cotton swab, a sealed container, a form to fill out. Yet every small step felt strangely monumental, like signing a document that would rewrite a piece of our lives. When everything was finished, I sealed the envelope and placed it near the door to mail the next morning. Sarah watched the envelope for a long moment before quietly asking a question I hadn't expected. "If she's Gary's," she said softly, "what happens then?" I looked at her carefully before answering. "Then we deal with the truth," I said. "Just like we should have done 28 years ago." She nodded slowly, though the sadness in her eyes suggested she already understood how difficult that truth might be. The waiting period felt longer than it probably was. Every day seemed stretched by the quiet tension that filled the house. Sarah moved through the rooms carefully, as if afraid that any sudden noise might break something fragile between us. I spent most of my time at work or sitting alone in the garage with old tools I had no real intention of using. Sometimes I caught myself studying old photographs of Lily and Ethan as children, searching their faces for clues that had never mattered before. Lily had always had Sarah's eyes, but now I found myself wondering whether there were traces of Gary in her smile, her posture, even the way she laughed. 3 weeks later the results arrived. I remember the exact moment because the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window in the same warm way it had the day I caught Sarah and Gary together. I held the envelope in my hands for several seconds before opening it, aware that the next few lines of text inside could permanently change the way our family understood itself. Sarah stood across the room near the counter, her arms folded tightly as if she were bracing for impact. I opened the envelope and unfolded the report slowly. My eyes scanned the page until they reached the section that mattered most. The words were clinical, precise, and completely indifferent to the emotional storm they carried. Probability of paternity, 0%. For a moment I simply stared at the numbers without fully absorbing their meaning. Then I continued reading until I reached the next line. Biological father, Gary Thompson. The room felt silent in a way that seemed almost unnatural. I lowered the paper slowly and looked at Sarah. She already knew. I could see it in her face. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't try to speak or defend herself. There was nothing left to defend. "Lily is Gary's daughter," I said quietly, hearing the words out loud for the first time. Sarah nodded once, her shoulders shaking slightly. I expected anger to explode inside me in that moment. I expected shouting, accusations, maybe even the kind of rage that destroys furniture and relationships alike. Instead what I felt was something quieter but somehow deeper, grief. Not just for the betrayal itself, but for the years of innocence that had existed before I knew the truth. For 28 years I had been Lily's father in every way that mattered. I taught her how to ride a bicycle, walked her down the aisle at her wedding, and sat beside her hospital bed when she broke her arm in middle school. None of those memories had changed, yet the meaning behind them suddenly felt more complicated than before. Sarah finally spoke through her tears. "Tom, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but every year that passed made it harder." I looked at her for a long moment before responding. "The truth doesn't get easier with time," I said quietly. "It just gets heavier." That evening I made 2 phone calls that would bring the rest of the family into the story we had been hiding for nearly 3 decades. The first call was to Gary. The second was to Lily and Ethan. Because secrets can survive for many years in silence, but once the truth begins to surface, it has a way of demanding that everyone finally face it. The first call I made that evening was to Gary. For several seconds after dialing his number I simply stared at the screen of my phone, aware that the conversation about to happen would probably be one of the most difficult of my life. Gary answered on the 3rd ring. His voice sounded cautious, almost nervous, as if he had been expecting my call ever since the day I caught him and Sarah in the kitchen. "Tom," he said carefully. "Yeah," I replied. For a moment neither of us spoke. There was a strange weight in the silence, like 2 men standing on opposite sides of a river neither of them knew how to cross. Finally I said the words that had been waiting inside my chest ever since I opened the envelope. "I got the results back." Gary didn't ask what results I meant. He knew. I could hear his breathing change slightly on the other end of the line. "And," he said quietly. I looked down at the paper again even though I already knew every line on it by heart. "Lily is your daughter." The silence that followed lasted longer than any pause in our conversation had ever lasted before. When Gary finally spoke again, his voice sounded lower, heavier. "I always wondered," he admitted. "You wondered?" I repeated, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. "For 28 years you wondered if my daughter was yours, and you never said a word." Gary let out a slow breath. "It happened once," he said. "Back then we both convinced ourselves it was a mistake that would never matter again." I felt my jaw tighten. "It mattered," I said. "It mattered every single day for the last 28 years. You just let me live inside a lie." Gary didn't try to argue with that. "You're right," he said quietly. "I did." His honesty only made the anger inside me more complicated. I had spent most of my life believing my brother was someone I understood, someone I could rely on when things became difficult. Now I was realizing that the person I thought I knew had been carrying a secret that could have shattered our family at any moment. "Does Lily know?" Gary asked cautiously. "Not yet," I said. "But she will." Another long pause followed before he spoke again. "Do you want me there when you tell her?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. For a moment I considered telling him to stay as far away as possible from the conversation, but then I realized something important. The truth belonged to all of us now. "Yes," I said finally. "You should be there." The next call I made was to Lily and Ethan. I told them there was something important we needed to discuss as a family and asked if they could come to the house the following weekend. They both agreed without hesitation, though I could hear the curiosity in their voices. Neither of them had any idea how much their understanding of our family was about to change. The week leading up to that conversation felt longer than any week I could remember. Sarah moved through the house carefully, speaking only when necessary and spending long hours sitting alone in the living room. Gary called once to ask if I had changed my mind about the meeting, but I told him the plan remained the same. When Saturday finally arrived, the sky was clear and unusually warm for the season. Lily arrived first, stepping out of her car with the same confident stride she had carried since she was a teenager. Ethan followed about 20 minutes later, joking about traffic and asking if something was wrong because my voice had sounded strange on the phone earlier that week. For a brief moment I considered abandoning the entire conversation and pretending everything was fine. But the envelope with the DNA results was sitting on the kitchen counter, a quiet reminder that some truths refuse to stay hidden forever. We all gathered in the living room where Sarah sat beside me on the couch. Gary arrived last. When he stepped through the door, the tension in the room became immediately noticeable. Lily looked from him to me with a puzzled expression. "Okay," she said slowly. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath before speaking. "There's something about our family history that you both need to know," I said. Ethan leaned forward slightly, while Lily crossed her arms in a way that reminded me of Sarah when she was frustrated. "You're starting to scare me," she said. I glanced at Sarah briefly before continuing. "About 28 years ago," I said carefully, "your mother and Gary made a mistake." Lily's eyebrows lifted slightly, and Ethan looked from me to Gary in confusion. "What kind of mistake?" Ethan asked. I picked up the envelope from the table and placed it in front of them. "The kind that changes people's lives." Lily opened the envelope slowly and scanned the report inside. I watched her eyes move across the page until they reached the line that mattered most. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she looked up at Gary. "You're my father?" she asked quietly. Gary nodded once, his face pale but steady. The room fell silent. Ethan stared at the paper, then at Lily, then back at me. "Wait," he said slowly. "You're saying Dad isn't?" I shook my head. "Biologically, no," I said. "But that doesn't change the last 28 years." Lily sat back against the couch, processing the information with a calmness that surprised me. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded thoughtful rather than angry. "I always wondered why Gary and I had the same crooked smile," she said quietly. Gary looked like someone who had just been given a second chance he never expected. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. Lily studied him for a moment before replying. "You didn't," she said. "The lie did." Her words hung in the air like a quiet truth none of us could argue with. The conversation that followed lasted for hours. There were tears, difficult questions, moments of silence that felt heavier than any argument. But something unexpected also began to happen as the evening continued. Once the secret was finally spoken out loud, the tension that had been wrapped around our family for decades slowly began to loosen. Ethan admitted he felt strange knowing that Gary was technically Lily's father, but also acknowledged that it didn't change how he saw any of us. Lily said the same thing in a different way. "The man who raised me is my dad," she said, looking directly at me. "DNA doesn't erase 30 years. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time since opening that envelope, I felt something inside my chest begin to settle. Later that night, after Lily and Ethan had gone home and Gary had quietly left the house, Sarah and I sat together in the living room again. The silence between us felt different now, not empty but reflective. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. I considered her words carefully before answering. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened," I said. "But living inside anger forever doesn't fix it either." She looked at me with cautious hope. "So what happens now?" she asked. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the house we had built together over 32 years. "Now we start telling the truth," I said. "Even when it's uncomfortable." In the months that followed, our family began the slow process of rebuilding itself with honesty instead of silence. Gary entered therapy to deal with the guilt and addiction problems he had been hiding for years. Sarah and I started counseling together, not to pretend the past hadn't happened but to understand how we had both allowed distance and secrets to grow between us. Lily and Ethan adjusted to the new reality of their family history with a resilience that reminded me how strong they had always been. By the time I turned 60, our lives looked different than they had before that afternoon when I walked into the kitchen and saw my brother holding my wife. The scars of that moment never completely disappeared, but they no longer defined everything around them. What remained instead was a quieter truth: betrayal can break a family apart, but silence can poison it even more deeply. And sometimes the only way to move forward is to bring every hidden piece of the past into the light, no matter how painful it may be.